Well, good afternoon and welcome to this CSG webinar on drones and insurance presented in collaboration with the Institute's Griffith Insurance Education Foundation. My name is Sean Sloan. I'm the Director of Transportation and Infrastructure Policy at the Council of State Governments in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm joined by Frank Paul Tomasello, Program Director of the Griffith Foundation, who joins us from suburban Philadelphia. Frank, it's always a pleasure to work with you and your team at Griffith.
Thank you, Sean. The pleasure's all ours. The team here at Griffith values its relationship with you and yours at CSG. It's a relationship built upon a shared commitment to delivering nonpartisan, non-advocative programming for the benefit of public policymakers. In the moments ahead, I'll introduce the experts who will lead our discussion on drones and insurance. But first, back to you, Sean, to touch upon logistics for the afternoon webinar.
Thanks, Frank, and a special thank you to all of the folks attending today's webinar who have bared with us through some technical issues that we had at the beginning. But should you have a question for our speakers at any time during the presentation, you may type it directly into the GoToWebinar interface on your computer screen. There is a question box on the GoToWebinar taskbar that you can use for precisely that purpose, and we will collect those here in Lexington and ask as many as time allows. And now back to Frank to introduce our speakers and get things started for us once again.
Thank you, Sean. Once thought of as a military technology, drones are now being used for personal and commercial purposes as well, creating a variety of new challenges for the insurance industry and for public policymakers. And here to explore those challenges are distinguished legal and risk management experts from Florida State University. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Kathleen McCullough, Associate Dean of Graduate Programs and Research for Florida State University's College of Business. In addition to overseeing academic strategy and policy for the college's graduate programs and supporting research, Dr. McCullough teaches risk management and insurance classes as part of the Dr. William T. Hold National Alliance Program in Risk Management at FSU. Also joined today by Attorney William Woodyard II, Chairman of the Faculty of the College of Business at Florida State University, where he teaches business law and real estate. Mr. Woodyard has been a professor and practicing attorney for some 41 years. Professors McCullough and Woodyard, we thank you for joining us. And to get things started, ask if you'd help to give us a better understanding of what drones are and how they're being used today.
Absolutely. We'd like to thank all of you for having us today and bearing through technical challenges that we may have seen. Today, our plan is fairly simple. We're going to spend some time in the beginning really talking about what drones are, because we all have our own idea about it, and the trends and some of the key risks in drones. Then we'll switch gears and we'll look at the legal and regulatory environment at both the federal and the state level, talking about the trends that we're seeing, what some of you are doing in your various states with regard to drones. And we'll also talk about these issues from the stakeholder perspective, from the hobbyists, the commercial user, and the government users, because as you'll see, each of those face different risks, but also different regulations. Next, we'll spend some time talking about challenges in the legal and regulatory environment, as well as insurance issues and trends, and then various conclusions as we wrap up. If at any time in this process you have questions, feel free to jump in. We're happy to answer those to the best of our ability. And the next slide. When Bill and I started talking about this, the biggest challenge we had was defining drones. And if you do any research on drones, what you'll see is they're technically called unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS is how you'll see them on the internet and in various resources. When I think of drones, I think of very small, agile devices, generally with a camera on it for surveillance, for photography, for filming. Bill, however, when he thinks of drones, he thinks big. He thinks of military drones. He thinks of things that can carry extremely large payloads. And really the answer is drones are all of that and everything in between. But what you see, no matter how you define drones, is rapid growth. There's over 770,000 registered drones with the FAA as of March 2017, and that came very, very quickly. When you look at the FAA forecast for the next few years, you see in 2020, they expect we'll go from 2.3 million hobbyist drone sales in the US to 4.3 million. That's huge. On the commercial side, you're also seeing an increase. And the bottom line is the FAA is expecting in 2020 over 7 million drone units sold. So you can see that that's one of the most rapid changes in technology. Now, couple that with we don't even know what those drones will look like because they're becoming lighter, faster, more powerful, also bigger in some cases and capable of carrying more. So the evolution of technology is one of the challenges along with just the growth of drones. If you go to the next slide, one of the things that's important when I look at risk analysis is always what the economic impact is. Because the bigger the economic impact, the more important the topic is for regulators, legislators, and consumers. And the Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems estimates 100,000 new jobs by 2022 and an economic impact of over $82 billion. So you can see that this is a huge growing segment that is going to demand our attention. And along with this rapid evolution is changes in commercialization and changes in what people are using it for. The FAA suggests that about 42% is industrial and inspection related use. Things like sending drones with cameras over construction sites, over different areas to inspect them, places maybe where you don't want to send or it's not easy to send a person in to inspect. On a similar vein, we see a lot of drone usage in real estate and aerial photography. The insurance industry is using drones quite a bit, again, for inspections, for claims audits, things of that nature, as is agriculture. Again, the agriculture area is using them for inspections. Also, some thoughts of spreading seeds, spreading pesticides, chemicals, other things. The last area up there is government. And the government use ranges from military to also local and law enforcement. And Bill will talk about some of the regulations with this, but there's a lot of controversy there because of the government using drones in terms of surveillance. And some of those issues, as well as the possibility to weaponize drones, of course, has people concerned. When you look at drones and the drone usage, one thing that I want you to keep in mind is drones are a disruptive technology. Think about 10, 15 years ago when e-commerce became the next big thing. And now think about how reliant we are on places like Amazon and other online retailers. That disruption in technology, the way that it has changed the retail industry and the ripple effects from that, the resulting changes in transportation, the changes in supply chain that have resulted. That's what we're looking at with drones. We're looking at a rapidly evolving technology. We're looking at a technology that has the potential to disrupt the way we deliver products, the way a lot of the people are employed in terms of photography and real estate and some of the inspection services in various industries. So there's going to be ripple effects. There's also going to be changes in risks. And let's talk a little bit about the major risks on the next slide. As we look at the major risks, the first thing that always comes up is safety. The FAA is extremely concerned about drones, especially when drones enter the airspace with regular airplanes. And things that are currently in our airspace. We've already seen several accidents of drones hitting commercial planes in various parts of the world. There's concern over people attaching weapons to drones. There's also concern with people losing control of drones. There's been reports of people hitting power lines and shorting out neighborhoods, people running their drone into people's windows and property, or hitting other people with them. All types of safety issues for those that aren't perhaps as skilled operating the drone or operating in difficult weather conditions. Right along with safety, the next big concern is always privacy. When you add a camera to a device that you can fly unmanned, you've really created new opportunities in terms of inspection and search and rescue and agriculture and real estate photography, but you've also created a really unprecedented way to invade people's privacy. And that's a big concern. I know in my own neighborhood a few months ago, we actually had a neighbor shoot another neighbor's drone down because he was flying it and looking in somebody's window. It created for a very awkward neighborhood day. But beside that, we've seen a lot of cases of these. A lot of issues in the legislation have been centered around where you can use drone cameras, what you can film, if you need warrants, all of that type of thing. And we'll talk about that more later. Varying definitions is a challenge. Defining what a drone isn't easy. Defining what a commercial drone isn't easy. You can't just use size, power, speed to define what these drones are. And that's a challenge because some of the drones that people buy for recreational use are essentially the same drone being used for commercial use. And a lot of hobbyists are taking advantage of the changing market, and they're using their drones to take pictures and videos and sell them commercially. So lots of blurred definitions, lots of challenges defining things as this market evolves and technology changes. Along with that, the changing legal and regulatory environment's a challenge. Keeping track of the laws, as Bill will talk about in a minute, the laws vary state by state, and there's lots of proposed legislation and regulation. If you're a multi-state commercial user, that's going to be a challenge. If you are just trying to forecast and do research and development for how you want to use drones in the future, the fact that the laws are changing rapidly creates some challenges for you. And last, the evolving insurance environment's a challenge. This coverage is really just emerging, and we'll talk about that as we move through. And what you'll see is there's variation in the types of coverages out there. There's variation in how insurers are applying definitions. And all of that creates a challenging market because it's hard for the insurance industry to get their hands around this new technology and also to get the data they need to price the coverage and to develop that coverage. And with that, I will turn things over to Bill, and he will go to the next slide and talk about the current legal environment.
Thank you, Kathleen. We're going to talk about the current legal and regulatory environment, federal environment. And as you probably already know, that the Federal Aviation Committee, the FAA administration, is a national aviation authority of the United States. And as an agency of the United States Department of Transportation, it has the authority to regulate and oversee all aspects of American civil aviation. Some of the terms that, people use that throw around the word drone, defined, but some of the industry terms are a nano drone, which is only about 2 inches across, or a micro drone, which is less than 55 pounds, or a tiny robot fly, which is only a couple of ounces or 1 ounce. And then you have your macro drones that are small airplanes or helicopters. And Kathleen said about the exponential growth of it. Amazon, he announced his autonomous delivery systems in 30 minutes. And so did DHL, and so did Domino's, and so did beer distributors. They want to all get in on this new technology. And federal regulation, all this exponential growth, in 2012, Congress decided to enact the FAA Modernization Reform Act in order to give the FAA control over this growing regulation of unmanned aircraft. The laws regarding the UAF in the United States are unsettled, and it is the opinion of the FAA that the use of UAVs for commercial purposes is prohibited without express authorization from the FAA. However, UAV technology has purposes without specific authorization from the FAA by individuals who have been liberally construing the definitions of model aircraft and recreational purpose in order to rationalize their use. It's hard. Some people have a hard time finding the statute is in the United States Code. It is 49 United States Code 4010. It's entitled Subtitle B, Unmanned Aircraft. It has basically 6 sections, Section 331, 332, 333, about 333 is special rules for certain unmanned aircraft, 335 safety studies, and 336 special rules for model aircraft. The FAA has, in 2016, in August, implemented rules, and under the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 14, Section 1.1, they have defined aircraft. And they have defined aircraft as any contrivance invented, used, or designed to navigate or fly in the air. And it goes on to say that defines aircraft as a device that is used or intended to be used for flight in the air. And so those are kind of rather vague definitions and still is unsettled. What we have been using for the law in the various states is the well-settled laws of privacy and trespass or property and insurance to fill in the gaps here. As to the rule, it's called Title IV Code of Federal Regulations 1.1. That actually is the easiest way for someone to operate a drone. This was passed an initial what you have to do is pass an initial aeronautical knowledge test at an FAA approved knowledge testing center, or you can hold a Part 61 pilot license or hold a 61 pilot certificate, all kinds of things. You can have you have to have a medical certificate. You can have one pilot with a remote pilot airman certificate or 2 crew members. You must not operate in a Class A airspace, which is 18,000 feet and above. The FAA regulates up to 100 kilometers into the air, about 60 miles up. There are prohibited and restricted areas. If you're going to launch something from Vandenberg or Cape Canaveral, you have to get permission to the FAA up to 100 miles or up to 60 miles. You have to have a temporary or permanent flight restricted for certain things. Prior authorization is needed from air traffic control when in controlled airspace. You certainly cannot use the military's airspace. There are all kinds of ranges throughout the United States where you can find that. You have to fly during daylight hours. You cannot exceed 100 miles per hour. You have to fly under 500 feet. Operation from a moving vehicle is allowed if from the ground or water vehicles in sparsely populated areas and not transporting property for compensation or hire, and not allowed if participating or under covered structure providing protection or if in a moving vehicle. You cannot operate multiple UAVs at the same time. After registration is required, and any aircraft under 55 pounds. And so there's a lot of requirements in that rule for you to do it. But if you are a commercial, you have to get that exemption. And as you can see from the slide, the exemptions are there. Kathleen talked about them: aerophotography, real estate, aerial inspection, aerial survey, construction, agriculture, infrastructure, filmmaking. Those are big ones. They've already have the exemptions. The FAA, if you want to get an exemption and it's similar to one that they've already granted an exemption for, they will issue a summary order granting you that exemption if it's similar. Utilities, landscape, and you can see oil and gas it's used for. Closed set filming, which they're using over, they're using the film industry is over in Houston right now, along with a lot of volunteers. Apparently there are 400 volunteers over there with their drones trying to help out for rescue. You can see sports can have it, security, and on and on and on. These are the things that have exemptions now under 33 of the statute. And then for the rulemaking, which came back in all, like you say, the big points are it operates only during standard daylight hours and within usual height. It must fly no higher than 500 feet and no faster than 100 meters. Must be at least 17 years of age and pass the FAA knowledge, and then the vehicle must be registered. Please. Here you can see the different, by states, the number of bills that were entered within that state. You can see the numbers of bills that were entered in 2017. The darker the state, the more bills that were entered. And those bills were about unmanned aerial systems legislation and crimes, law enforcement usage, autonomous vehicle legislation, enacted legislation, weaponization, and critical infrastructure. So those were the bills and the topics that were entered in those states, and you can see your state. Next slide, please. Preemption. There are several states who have preempted the cities and counties and the water districts and fire districts, and you can see them there. There are a variety of bills throughout these states and resolutions by the states, as you can see. In the green, there is a law, the existing law. In the turquoise, the dark turquoise, they have passed resolutions. In the purple, they've done both a law and resolution. And in the clear ones, there are no bills at that. But preemption is actually, as you well know, if a state rule or state statute or whatever it may be, administrative rule within the state violates or a federal statute, then Article 6 of the United States Constitution, second paragraph, will preempt the state if it's in conflict with that state's, with the federal statute or the Constitution. But a variety of states have, in fact, passed those bills and resolutions. Before exploring special topics of states having legislation, it's important to consider preemption before you do anything if you're going to enter into your state. The state or local law directly conflicts with federal laws or regulations. The state law or local law is likely to be invalidated because the FAA is the designated authority to regulate the U.S. airspace. So any state or local law that conflicts with the FAA regulations or attempts to regulate in an area that is within the purview of the FAA may be preempted. Recognizing that states and localities were increasingly acting on UAS's regulation, they released a fact sheet on December 7, 2015 to provide guidance. What they're basically saying is before you do anything, please contact the FAA and try to reach some sort of accord with them before you pass any laws. And they also want you to mandate equipment or training for related to aviation safety. Geofencing would be likely be. Courts have also found that state regulation pertaining to equipment requirements related to aviation safety is not the regulatory framework. Examples of laws with state and local government that do have laws traditionally related to power, land use, zoning, privacy, trespass, operations generally are not subject to federal regulation. Requirements to obtain a warrant prior to issuing a UAS for surveillance, specifying the UAS may not be used for voyeurism. Certainly invasion of privacy would be a tort claim. On using the UAS for hunting or fishing or to interfere or harass someone who has been hunting or fishing. Prohibitions on attaching firearms or similar, those things and resolutions in the privacy government warrant, as you can see, you're in the dark turquoise or the dark green portion require warrants from the government. Protection from non-government operators in that those that have both are in both that one that's in Texas, Florida. Those states do not have any government operator or warrant requirements, and so or warrant related federal issues. So one of the first UAS uses that captured the attention of legislators was the use of enforcement agents for Alaska, Florida, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Montana, Nevada, North Carolina, North Dakota, and Oregon, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, Virginia, and Wisconsin have passed legislation requiring law enforcement agents to obtain UAS for surveillance or to conduct a search. And so one of those states have already done that. A lot of other states have done that as well. Can you go to the next slide, please? And here we have criminal penalties. Criminal penalties exist in these states, states with U.S. specific crimes, and you can see them in the green. All of those have criminal penalties for interfering with the law, enforcement of public safety, recklessness, flying near critical structures, adding weapons or lasers, and unlawful surveillance. You know, like Kathleen said, a neighbor of them shot down one. Well, in Kentucky, and there was a case where a man shot it down because the drone was hovering over his daughter in the backyard or in the swimming pool, or she was sunbathing in the swimming pool. In Kentucky, they said that was okay. In California, the same thing occurred, and the landowner had to pay for the destruction of the drone. So it's state by state, case by case, whether or not it's an invasion of privacy, and that's what is going to happen. Next, please. I'll let you. Go ahead. Well, if you want to talk about it.
Okay.
Professor Woodyard, we thank you for helping us to better appreciate the current legal and regulatory landscape, and we'll send things back to Dr. McCullough in just a moment, and she'll consider the environment for commercial drone users. But first, I just wanted to remind folks that if you have a question, you may submit it through the GoToWebinar taskbar on your screen. So Dr. McCullough, please continue.
I want to say one more thing before we go forward. The military's drones are thousands of pounds. They probably carry 2,000 pounds of what you might think of drones. They're rather large aircraft.
A little bit more about the military uses here. One of the things as we started talking about this project, interesting, was the number of hobbyists that are using drones. And you see that there's rapid growth, we learned earlier, but also there's very few routes to a hobbyist. There's a lot of safety guidelines and requirements, regulations and laws. Now, that's not to say that take your drone out and fly it however you want. There are criminal penalties. So, when Bill was back in Kentucky and California, then issues make FAA and the other agencies is safety guidelines are important. And before you start flying these, that you have to understand how to operate, that you're in a safe area. As I said before, lines they've shorted out. A lot of different things have happened with the drones that they're really trying to. The other real gray area, and I think this is important as we think about it, is insurance. And site after site and expert after expert says you have to call your agent if you want to know if it's going to be covered or it's as a hobby. As an insurance professor, that's an answer that always makes me out. But the reality is it's depending on the drone, depending on how you're using it, and depending on your insurance company is whether or not they're going to extend coverage under the homeowner's policy or they're going to exclude it under the exclusion. If you're using this, you can almost exclude it. Otherwise, where you're going to fly it, training, all of this. So if it's a small drone, you do want to consult, especially if you're going to use it for anything. If you're going to fly it competitively in a race or an exhibition. One thing that I did find, if you're a member of the American Mod Association, has insurance for its members, and in terms of limits, they have $2.5 million in liability coverage, $25,000 in medical, and then another $1,000 in fire and theft coverage. So out there, that is evolving. I think as we continue to skyrocket over 4 million drone units sold in a year, in the coming years, we're going to see the insurance industry much more clear on personal use for drones and how they're going to cover that. Now, if you go to the next slide, the commercial environment is a little bit different. There's a wide variety of legislation, as Bill was telling you about, and so you want to keep up with that in your given state. There's also the ability to have to register, and there's exemptions. To add to the slide that Bill had talked about earlier with the exemptions, one of the things you'll see here is that most of the exemptions were given to businesses smaller than $1 million in revenue. And it's hard to tell if that's because most drone-related businesses are small businesses and startups, or if that's just where they're granting the exemptions. But I did think that that was an interesting statistic, and we'll definitely want to monitor that as we move forward. Now, however, with the large potential profits and things like Amazon and other delivery-related companies talking about the needs for drones, you'll see that this area is going to continue to grow. And as it continues to grow, the insurance market will start to develop. There already is a market out there. There's several carriers involved in the market. The coverage is not standardized at this point. Okay, one of the challenges with these new and emerging coverages is getting data, having the insurance companies really understand the risks so that they can price it and they can underwrite it effectively. You'll see this a lot with emerging products. For those of you who followed insurance over the years, when cyber insurance became a big issue, that market took several years to evolve and try to figure out what real terms and conditions needed to be out there, to understand what the exposures were, and to collect the data to understand what the risk is and what the potential loss is. When you lay that over the fact that the legal environment is still changing, it's hard to know what the potential size losses are going to be in a liability case related to drones. So it's going to be a challenging market. In terms of the insurance products, something about liability is obviously a big issue, and you can guess what those issues are: personal damage, the privacy issues we've been talking about. The hull coverage, so the coverage for the actual drone, is a big issue. Payload, as these drones start delivering things, payload is going to be more and more of an issue. In some cases, you're going to be delivering a pizza, maybe not as critical. In other cases, you may be delivering a very highly developed piece of military equipment or industrial equipment, much bigger issue. Ground equipment is something you have to think about. Remember, we're not using a drone in our office for the most part. We're taking these expensive items out into the environment, computer equipment and remote control equipment with us. So that's something that you have to think about, as well as having that equipment out of your regular workspace and how electronic equipment is covered. A lot of times people rent or lease. So for the whole payload and ground equipment coverage related to that, buying the drone yourself or using that's going to be an issue. And purpose is also an issue with drones. So for those of you who are familiar with insurance, a lot of this talk about mobile equipment, we talk about auto insurance or marine insurance. You're going to see very similar coverages because the exposures are the same, but we're going to see some changes as things develop in this marketplace, and when they start to really understand what the risks are and how expensive these things are. Right now, you'll get higher prices and a little bit more narrow coverage. As the market develops, pricing should settle and the coverages should start to expand a little bit. The next slide. The last kind of group I want to talk about is government use. And this is really interesting to me because it's where we get into the military, the law enforcement, the cities. States are active in the area. And it's a little bit surveillance, audio surveillance first became an issue, okay? There were initially lots of questions and a flurry of legislation that came out on whether or not you need to use audio equipment. We're seeing the same thing on whether or not you need a warrant to use a drone for surveillance, and Bill can add to this. The other issue that is obviously important is safety, especially because you could equip weapons and lasers and things like that to these drones. Privacy is a big issue. It goes into that surveillance issue that I was just talking about. what you can do with the data you obtain, how long you have to use it if it's admissible in court. And those are all things that states are grappling with as this new technology emerges, and you could use drones for search and rescue. In Houston, they used drones quite a bit in the last week with Harvey, as they were trying to assess damage, look for life safety issues, those sorts of things. Bill, did you want to add anything on the emergence of?
Yeah, if you all remember, the government started using infrared detection from airplanes to detect whether somebody was growing marijuana in their home, and without a warrant. And the courts basically ruled on that. That was such a new technology, and using infrared, it was required. They were required to get a search warrant in that case because it was not normal. It was not a normal technology for ascertaining or invading somebody's privacy. And so they did require, in that case, for them to go and get a search warrant. And the same thing is here. With a new technology like this, they're probably going to require that. Where does somebody invade your privacy? Well, do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy? And that's the issue. Certainly, she said, looking in someone's bathroom window with your drone would certainly be invasion of privacy. And then another one becomes trespass. Are you trespassing? Are you below the 300? Are you within the below 300 feet or 350 feet for which the FAA will not allow a plane to go under? And so some states say that you are trespassing. Some states say that you are not with their state law. The one thing that I really, really wanted to tell you is that the difference with the rule now, the easiest way to get to be able to, well, certainly the difference between flying for fun or a hobby is different than what you need to do for flying for work or for a job. Under Title 14, because of all the exceptions that were filed for for work, now all you have to do now, and they have streamlined that under Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Section 1.1. And like we said before, you must have pilot airman certificate, 16 years of age. You must pass the TSA vetting. You must be less than 50. You must be registered if over 55 pounds online. You undergo undergo pre-flight check to ensure the UAS is in condition or safe operation. You can operate it in Class G airspace. Operating rules: you must keep the aircraft in sight, like we said before. You must fly it under 400 feet. The 500 feet is for a lineal measure. Must fly during the day. Must fly at or below 100 miles per hour. Must yield the right of way to manned aircraft. Must not fly over people. Must not fly from a moving vehicle. Some of these vehicles have been spotted at 10,000 feet. Flying, again, for work, if you're flying for commercial use, providing aerial surveying or photography services, or flying incidental to a business, inspections, etc. There's a thing of applications. And 14 of the code of part 1 of. So if you're interested in doing that and revisiting the requirements for flying for work, that's where you'll find the newest FAA rule, Title 14, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 107, which is distinguished from the hobbyist or flying for fun.
And if you'll head to the next slide, Bill will talk a little bit about some of the challenges and trends in the regulatory and legislative environment.
Like I said, defining drones as a technology allows for smaller, stronger, faster drones. Like I said, you've got nano drones, you've got micro drones, tiny robot flies, and macro drones, and you've got the military drones, over 55 pounds, and those are the ones that generally the military uses. integrate the FAA with traditional aviation, and that's why they passed the statute in 2020 and modernized the FAA to do that. The safety challenges as drone use increases, there's going to be a products liability potential tort claim from the manufacturer if it's defectively manufactured. Who's going to be at fault? Just like an airplane, was it pilot error or was it autonomous error? Or those are the issues that might come up there, along with tort liability, along with privacy, along with trespass, and all the other things that if your drone comes out of the air and hurts somebody's person or property, you are going to be liable. Evolving issues relating to privacy and trespassing. The old traditional invasion of privacy and trespassing laws, because they're not really defined in the statutes or the rules, we're going to revert to the law as it is in the states, and they have been until we can figure out exactly how to handle that, or the FAA can handle it with its experts. Because there are blurred lines between hobbyist use and commercial use. Some of the commercial people are trying to say that they're aircraft or hobbyists, but what you really should do is make yourself available to this new rule, and because it's streamlined it so that you can actually operate it for work under 107 under the rule. So please look at that. Balancing innovation and privacy concerns. The internet put us everywhere. I don't care what you do, it's on the internet. And now that you have drones, even more is going to be on the internet. It's going to be recorded. It's going to be used in lawsuits. It's going to be used in everything. The post office is testing out things, packages to your home. And like I said, Domino's is trying to do that to deliver pizzas. Amazon says they can do 20 miles of one of its 13 distribution points. They'll deliver from the time you ordered it in 30 minutes. And I don't think that anybody knows where the future of drones is. And so they're going to have to, in the future, rely on traditional property, trespass, and privacy laws until we find out exactly where this innovation is going.
Right. In the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about insurance markets. And if you noticed, we started out with a lot of the very same bullet points because the insurance industry is really struggling, again, how to define drones, how they're going to fit in the context of the rapidly emerging legislation, so that they know what their exposures and risks are. One of the challenges, if we're issuing a product even annually in a market changing this rapidly with how people are using innovation, we don't know what it's going to look like. And so really understanding the risks as there's more drones out there is going to be a challenge, and finding the data. And I think data has to be the most important issue, is the insurance companies figure out how to price this and how to write the coverage. They need data, they need claims data, they need accident data to start to figure out what this market really looks like, what the exposures are, and how to fit into it, meet the needs of both the public and those operating the drones. Again, it's going to be a challenge until legislation and regulation and rules stabilize so that they know what the risk is and they know what the penalties are going to be. In defining those exposures beyond the traditional property and liability exposures, what business interruption exposure is going to look like with respect to drones. If you have a windy area all of a sudden and you can't deliver within 30 minutes, what is that going to look like? All kinds of things that we can't quite envision now because we don't know what the technology is going to bring, and we don't know what the parameters for operating drones are going to really look like in the future. And then that blurred line between commercial and hobbyist, that's really something that today's world of the gig economy, people having businesses for short periods, the entrepreneurial businesses, we see more and more of this in the economy. And so as people start to use their drone on the weekend for income, after hours, that sort of thing, those lines are going to become more and more of a challenge for us as the insurance industry tries to develop the product and decide what should be covered under a homeowner's policy and what needs a separate commercial use policy. And if we go to the last, yes.
Frank Tomasello here at Griffith. Just wanted to jump in for a moment or so. As we mentioned at the beginning of the program, questions are encouraged, and I thought we'd stop down for a moment and pose a question of you. I think your comments of a moment ago perhaps addressed many aspects of this question, but maybe not all of them. Could you speak a bit to why there are not more sophisticated insurance coverages specifically for commercial users?
Sure. I think it really is a data issue. I think that the insurance industry, rightfully so, moving in a measured way to figure out what the exposure is, what the real risk is, and the loss potential is, and how to underwrite these. They have some idea in terms of underwriting and what you need to know from safety and regulations. But in terms of what the ultimate exposure is, like say a drone clips a power line today and takes out a shopping mall's power, what's the exposure there? We have some ideas from other disciplines, but really understanding that risk for drones is going to be a challenge. So I think as they collect the data and as the market stabilizes a little bit, we'll start to see more coverage develop, and the coverage will be more reasonably priced and probably a little bit broader and a little bit deeper as they understand the risk and have the data.
Thank you, Dr. McCullough.
Do you have any other questions for us at this point? Just a few closing comments. The drone use is skyrocketing, and this is something that's not going to go away. It's only going to get bigger. Technology is only going to allow us to do more with drones. People are going to push that envelope of line of sight use of drones. If you think about some of the delivery things that people like UPS are talking about, the post office, Amazon, it may not always be feasible that the drone operator is operating a single drone and in line of sight. And so regulation is going to probably be pushed in that area as technology increases. And like all technologies, the insurance industry as well as commercial users are going to have to understand the potential of this and understand what the risks and exposures are. So I think the economy is going to continue to change, and this is going to be a really dynamic issue for all of you that are lawmakers and public policy makers to grapple with in the next few years. So we hope that you have enjoyed this. If you have any more questions, Bill and I are happy to entertain those. Or if you'd like to reach out to us afterwards, you can find us both here at Florida State. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McCullough and Professor Woodyard. Thank you again for that presentation. We want to turn to questions, any questions from our webinar audience. And just a reminder that you can send us your question for our presenters by typing it into the GoToWebinar taskbar interface where it says questions. And while we wait for those to roll in, Frank, I know that you had a couple of questions for our presenters today that you wanted to ask.
Yes, professors, just a couple of questions. Among them, do you see the trend to increased legislation continuing? And if so, in what areas?
Absolutely. Those that are, if you go back to, let's see, slide number 10. Can you get back to slide 10?
Sorry, we're working on it.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'll tell you what they are. Usually, it'll be about crimes that are committed. Weaponizing drones. Privacy, enforcement usage, how they can use it. Those are the types of things that will be the subject of of criminal. Certainly privacy, but talk about criminal. California legislature passed several bills in 2015 related to penalties for misuse, including, because they have a wildfire, including increasing penalties for flying over wildfires, as you see in California right now. California's got a statute about that, and prohibiting flying them over correctional facilities, taking in contraband into correctional facilities. And you cannot fly over a K through 12 school. These three, though, California, Jerry Brown bills. And in his veto, Brown stated that each of these bills creates a new crime, usually a novel way to characterize and criminalize conduct that is already. And so he just said it was already included in the law. This far in 2016, 6 states, Arizona, Louisiana, Oregon, Tennessee, Utah, and Vermont have passed legislation related to criminal penalties. Arizona made it a Class 1 misdemeanor to operate a U-Haul regulation or to interfere with a firefighter or emergency services operation using a UAS. It also made using a UAS intentionally photograph or near a critical facility in furtherance of a criminal Class 6 felony. Critical facility, petroleum production facility, chemical manufacturing, energy centers, any railroad facility, courthouses, military installations, among others. All characterized that the definition of aircraft includes a UAS for the purpose of offense or reckless aircraft operation. Louisiana in 2016 adopted an intentionally crossing a police cordon using a drone to a crime and obstructing an officer. And the law allows our fire department personnel to disable the UAS if it endangers the public or officer's safety. Oregon made it a Class A misdemeanor in 2016 to operate a weaponized UAS. The law also created the offense of interference with aircraft, making it a violation if someone uses the UAS to direct a laser at an aircraft while the aircraft is in the air. Aircraft while the air prevent or take off a craft. Law adds using UAS or recoil in certain circumstances to the offense of invasion of privacy in the second degree. It also makes a Class A violation to operate a UAS over critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure defined, like I said, of petroleum and aluminum refineries, electrical power facilities, chemical, polymer, rubber and manufacturing facilities, transportation facilities, among others. And it goes on, and the list goes on and on and on. I can stand here for an hour and tell you about other.
Thank you, Professor. That sort of broad brush. I know we're sort of rapidly running out of time here, but a final question on my side, and then Sean, if there are any questions on your end, of course, we welcome those. But if we switch gears and sort of head back to the issue of coverage options, a question perhaps, Professor McCullough, for you. When do you foresee more coverage options developing? You alluded earlier to the issue of data sort of being a bit of a wild card at this point, but if you had to look into the crystal ball, what things look like a potential future development of more coverage options?
I think in the next 5 years, you're going to see significantly more options and more capacity in the market. I think it's just going to take a few years of develop and for the legislation to stabilize a little bit. So as those things happen, I think you'll see the market continue to grow.
Great. Well, thank you again, Professor McCullough and Professor Woodyard. We are just about out of time for today's webinar. Thanks again so much for joining us this afternoon, and please stay safe during the hurricane later this week. Thanks also to my co-host, Frank Paul Tomasello from the Institute's Griffith Foundation. As always, this webinar will be archived and available on the CSG Knowledge Center and on the Griffith Foundation website. So if you missed any part of the program or would like to recommend it to a friend, it will be available soon. Be sure to check the CSG website for information about any future webinars and policy materials on this topic and others. And to check the Griffith Foundation website for information on risk management and insurance resources and programs as well. I'm Sean Sloan at CSG headquarters in Lexington. Thank you for joining us.